failures to achieve human rights, identify inequalities in outcomes between people with disabilities and others, look at what are the causes, the root causes of such inequalities, establish what works in terms of tackling inequalities, quantify the scale of action needed and the cost, and inform and guide public policy. And I think it's really valuable to say, in looking at a research agenda, to take the UNCOPD as a framework. And there are a lot of very practical day-to-day issues that it has identified in particular articles. Freedom from discrimination in Article 5, mobility and accessibility that Robbie has talked about, Article 9, equality before the law, Article 12, again Robbie talked about that. Personal liberty, freedom from abuse, Article 14 and 16, we heard about that from Robbie. Education, Article 24, independent living and community inclusion, Article 19, employment, Article 27, health, access to rehabilitation and habilitation, Article 25 26, right to family life equivalent to others, Article 23, political participation, again Robbie talked about that, Article 29, and social and community participation, things like recreational sport, Article 30. So there's a huge research agenda, I think, set out that gives a very good framework for that. I want to say too, I think there's a real value. Robbie talked about anecdote and the value of, I suppose, and I think we all heard very emotionally the real value of that lived experience and what he had to say. But I think it's also really, really important to have hard data to say how much, what is the size of the gap, how many people, and again Robbie had facts and figures for us as well in his presentation.
Sorry, could you speak into the mic?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Essential to have hard data. And when you want to do something about remedying rights or breaches of rights, having hard facts and figures is really critical in engaging with policymakers and in quantifying the scale of what needs to be done. And one of the things we do have in Ireland, we have rich and valuable sources of statistical information. I was coming down the train last night, I was reading a report that was done in Britain on trying to quantify future need for adult disability services. And they really were, like licking their fingers and putting it up in the air and doing a bit of guesswork, because they don't have the quality of actually statistical information we have here that can guide and inform policy and planning. So we have, for example, we include now this, I would have done a lot of work on the Central Statistics Office over the years, but the disability variables are now included in all mainstream data collection. So something like the labour force survey and the income and expenditure survey, and all of those household surveys have variables around disability, so that you can use any of the questions there, or the survey of income and living conditions, to look at differences in poverty and inequality, and whether people go to the doctor or go to the dentist, or why they don't. Do they go because they don't go because they can't afford it, or because they're afraid of doctors? You can pick up all of that stuff by people with disabilities and people without disabilities. So we have a huge valuable source of data. The census has, since 2002, included 2 specific questions on disability, and again, hugely valuable information. We heard Robbie quoting from some of that. The National Disability Database is operated by the Health Research Board, particularly the National Intellectual Disability Database, been very good in its coverage, very rich source of data, and I've used that an awful lot. And one of the pieces of work I've done recently was looking at respite services, and by just crunching the numbers, I was able to show that only 1 in 4 families with somebody with a disability at home have any access to respite services. So 3/4 of people, 3/4 of adults living at home, there's no respite provision available. So, again, when you look at the scale of what's there, that's useful information. The National Disability Survey 2006, huge piece of work. We really have only skimmed the surface of looking at it, but again, the National Disability Authority would have commissioned pieces of work looking at the nature of disability, how it interacted with social inclusion,
looking at transport. How do people with disabilities get around, living in different kinds of areas, whether it's a big city or, you know, in a little village or in open countryside. Looking at access to assistive technology and so on. So there's an awful lot of information there that while it's 2006, it's still very much a portrait of people's lives and gives you very useful information for policy. There's disability variables in Growing Up in Ireland longitudinal survey, so we can track children born with a disability or children who acquire a disability. And then in older life, we have disability variables in the TILDA, the longitudinal survey of ageing, and we have the special survey like the IDS TILDA, which is the intellectual disability one that has tracked a series of people with intellectual disability from age 40 up. And it again has documented really important things about their lives and about, I mean, something as simple about quality of life as how many people get to choose what television programme they watch, or what clothes they wear, or what food they eat, or what time they go to bed at, and how that has differed by where they were living. So again, really, really useful information. So getting the hard facts and figures and moving beyond anecdote and enriching anecdote or complementing the qualitative research with quantitative is really, really important. And in my work over the years, I have used research findings to take them and into policy. And I think it's really important to have an interplay between people with disabilities, the research community and policymakers, because you can be doing research and it sits, you know, in a small disability person's organisation, or it sits in an academic publication written up in very academic language. But if you want something to translate into policy action, there needs to be a threefold relationship between people with disabilities saying what are the important things about their lives and being part of the whole setting that research agenda, as well as, you know, telling their stories in the process of the research itself. The involvement of the research community and academics who are able to say, well, actually, you know, that's an issue of importance to people with disabilities. We actually know tons about it, and it's all been written up here. But this is an area we really know nothing about, so in prioritising areas where there are big holes in our knowledge and understanding. And the policy-making community, first of all, so that if they're engaged in the research questions and from the get-go, the questions that are important to them in terms of doing something about it, the information they need to know if they're going to progress something, and that's very often is about numbers and hard facts and figures. But also that if they're involved in the design of the research and in monitoring and overseeing the research from the beginning, then they will read and digest and act on the proceeds of the research, where if it's something that comes in at them as an external piece, well, people are busy, they're doing their day-to-day stuff, and there's a big research report maybe not written in language they understand, where if people have been part of that research process, it's been really valuable. So among the areas of work that I think have taken research and through the policy and into practice have been the time to move on from congregated settings, which took international research which had been done showing that people who live in institutions and in group settings have definitively much lower quality of life than other people. So we would know that instinctively, but this is hard research that policymakers believe in. Then there was the work that was looking at what had happened, what was happening in Irish congregated settings, and it was awful. And that has led to a policy which has, bit by bit, we now have only half as many people living in these centres as we had in 2011 when the report was published. Still very slow, but at least it's happening and it's an official policy, and nobody is now being readmitted into those centres. So that was a very important piece of work. The comprehensive employment strategy for people with disabilities, going back about 15 years, the National Disability Authority would have documented the gap in employment levels between people with disabilities and others, and looked at what were the factors behind it, like lower levels of educational attainment, like employer ignorance and prejudice, like issues that employers were worried about, like insurance and health and safety, and that you need to actually unpick all of these pieces and act on a whole range of fronts. And the outcome of that, and it took 10 years from start to finish to get it delivered, was the Comprehensive Employment Strategy for People with Disabilities. And it is interesting to know that while employment levels of people with disabilities are still significantly below the rest of society, that they actually improved significantly between 2011 and 2016. So things are beginning to happen. And in the Celtic Tiger years, employment rates for people with disabilities actually dropped. So in the most recent economic upturn, actually employment rates for people with disabilities have gone up. So that's kind of important. The research that preceded the Make Work Pay for people with disabilities, that report, and that culminated ultimately in people saying, well, the biggest issue was the medical card. So as a result of that, last Christmas there was a change made in the income limit for medical cards for people on disability allowance. And again, that's kind of a practical step that was research and evidence based. So that it's very important to provide that link, I think, between for research, action and policy, because we can all feel very angry and about inequalities and a failure to deliver rights for people with disabilities. But actually making something happen is really important. And in my work over the years, I think one of the biggest research gaps I have found, there's actually a lot of research that shows what is the size of the gap and that there are gaps between people with disabilities and others on all sorts of dimensions. But there's much less research and good quality research done on what actually works. So, for example, the piece of work I was doing on respite, that while lots of people said, they enjoyed respite or families found the break was good, there's actually very little hard evidence to show that people who get respite do better than people who don't get respite, because the research hasn't actually been done, or it hasn't been done with big enough samples or to a high enough standard. So that's a big shortage of, there's a problem, but what works to do something about it? And that's a big policy gap. So I really welcome this session and the fact that we're having an open discussion about what should be the research agenda, and I hope that comes up with some very practical answers that can be taken forward.
Thank you. I'm just going to give a few reflections on, I think, some of the things that I've learned as a non-disabled researcher involved in research with people with disabilities. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tentative findings we have from the surveys so far. But as I said this morning, the survey that is part of today's event is open for another week. So please do fill it out if you haven't already, and please do talk to us about accessible formats as well if there's something in it that doesn't work for you. So one of the things that I've learned about starting well motivated, wanting to involve disabled people in research has been the challenges and the barriers in finding what Robbie described as the non-elite or the more marginalised groups of people with disabilities. So if you do things the appropriate traditional research way, you would access individuals through gatekeepers. So you would go to the services, or you would go to family-based organisations or others to try to access people with disabilities, apart from the people who are already in the public, being, I suppose, public about their experiences and being vocal, taking legal cases like Robbie described. So those gatekeepers that you approach to access individuals can pose lots of different kinds of barriers to researchers. So no one has any issue in going through research ethics approval processes. This is all very normal and what we expect. But having gone through different kinds of research ethics approval in disability services and elsewhere, I've noticed that it's a very laborious process often. The kinds of things that you are sometimes asked to do might conflict with actually what your ideology as a researcher is. So one good example of that is a project that I ran that some of you know about called Voices, which was about people with disabilities' experiences of being denied legal capacity or using support to exercise their legal capacity. And I had very generous funding for the project from the European Research Council. And one of the first things that they asked me after approving the project, where I talked about how I was going to involve people who had been denied legal capacity to write about their experiences under their own name and in a book that we would publish together. And I kept getting this question from the ethics officer in the Research Council about, can I confirm that I will not involve anyone in the project who is effectively under guardianship and has been denied legal capacity without the consent of their guardian? And I kept saying, like, did you read the proposal? Like, this is the whole point of this project, is to involve people who may, yes, have been declared to lack legal capacity. But it was really difficult to communicate, I suppose, even though the whole proposal had been approved and granted funding. I kept getting this one-line email from someone saying, like, yes, but confirm that everyone who's under guardianship will have the consent of their guardian. And I kept trying to explain all the things that I would do to make sure that the person could participate and it was their choice and not the guardian's choice. It was a really big struggle. I think there's also maybe a need to change how we traditionally recruit research participants if we're trying to access the kinds of communities, Robbie, that you spoke about. And I don't think researchers are going to solve that on our own, because as you talked about Bourdieu's concept of habitus, we are used to following the same procedures to find research participants. So if we need to break out of that cycle, we need to talk a lot more with disabled people directly about how and what other mechanisms and what would work to find people. So the internet can be a great way to find people, but not everyone has access to the internet. And people, for example, who are living still in segregated settings certainly might not have independent access or private access to the internet, even to fill out something like the survey that we're using for today. So we're very aware of that and the need to think of new creative ways to engage people. But something that also links to what Ethna said about, convincing policymakers, and something that I have kind of grappled with in my work, is about knowing when it's time to give up your seat at the table. So researchers love to be invited into policy discussions because we feel like we can make a difference, we have the evidence, we have the information. But again, we need to challenge this practice of only asking people who are perceived to be research experts who are not disabled people, when the real experts are the people with the lived experience. And sometimes that might mean not giving up your seat at the table and saying, you've invited me to this consultation, but actually who you really should invite is this person, because they have the real lived experience. Or refusing to participate in it unless people with disabilities are also invited and included, and meaningfully included, not just tokenistically. And in the same way that some of my colleagues, for example, would refuse to participate as academics on panels that are all male, because they would say, well, that's not representative and that's not fair, so I'm not going to participate in that. I think non-disabled researchers should think about their responsibility to not participate in exercises like this, which exclude disabled people. And my experience of when it works and when you are facilitated to do a process collaboratively with disabled people and to bring disabled people into the conversation with policymakers is that it does really impact and it does really change what comes out of that process. And the policymakers or the decision makers speak quite differently about what they will and won't do when they're faced directly with a person whose life it actually impacts. And I think that's really important. Although, of course, that's a huge burden to ask someone to take. And it's not something that every disabled person should feel like they have to put their trauma on the line over and over just to get some very basic changes. Another thing that I've encountered is this kind of idea that we'll only involve disabled people in research or policy making if they play nicely. So don't be too much of a troublemaker, don't be litigating all these issues at the same time, because then why would we have you, in the room, because you're already, costing us all this money and all this hassle and all this bad press. So I think we have to, again, challenge that assumption that it's only for people who will play the game or who will behave in certain ways that policymakers are used to people behaving in rooms. And I think that's really important for researchers to participate in and make space for those kinds of discussions. And then I think us as researchers, we have to be willing to learn and take constructive criticism when we are called out for being not accessible, not inclusive in our work, in our practices. Many people can get understandably defensive when they're called out like this, because they feel like, oh, I'm trying, I'm doing my best, and you don't understand, it has to be done this way because otherwise it's not research and so on. But I really think that we're learning more and more about all the different ways that you can do what is valid research, and that we need to be much more open to taking on the potential criticisms that we might receive from people whose lives, again, are deeply impacted by the work that we do. So those are just a few thoughts from me, and I'm just going to share now some of the things that have come up so far in the questions that we put out in the disability survey, and then I might ask you, Robbie, to reflect on some of these, and Edna as well. So the first question we asked in the survey is, what issues related to disability in Ireland and Northern Ireland are most in need of human rights and equality research? And some of the topics that have come up so far include... include accessibility, housing, employment, ageing, education, reasonable accommodation, services, funding, women with disabilities and marriage. These are just some of the things that have come up so far, and some of those we've already heard from both Ethna and Robbie as well, but it might also, there might also be other things that you in the audience might think of too. We also asked what are the main barriers to doing the kind of research that is needed in this area. Lack of funding came up very much, and lack of resources as a barrier to doing this kind of research, but also lack of voice of disabled people themselves, that was a barrier to doing the kind of research that people felt was really needed. Or a lack of information about what research is, how people can get involved, and what benefits it might bring them. We also asked a question about who should be involved in setting the research agenda and the conduct of the research, and the answers to this were very clear again, that it should be disabled people directly that are involved in setting the research agenda. But others went broader than that, so talked about local government, national government, other kinds of stakeholders, NGOs, services to employers, people who are providing health services, universities. Some people talked about having a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach to deciding how research should be conducted, and so on. And our next question was about how can the human rights and equality research in disability better reach its intended target audience, including policymakers. So something that Ethna, you talked about, the importance of making sure research doesn't just sit on a shelf or in an academic journal, and actually the messages are communicated to those who need it to create the kind of change we want. So again, we had lots of suggestions here about participation of policymakers in research or of the intended targeted audience, which might include disabled people or families in the research process from the beginning, better promotion of research findings, the idea of doing roadshows or targeted training for specific groups to inform them about the findings of research, having events like today, or events that are accessible, that are free to attend, at which this information can be shared, and making sure that the decision makers are guided by expert opinion, both from disabled people directly and from other kinds of researchers. So the final question that we asked was about who it is that's filling out this survey, and we recognised that people might fall into several different categories. So we asked them to tell us which category, and they can choose as many as they wish. So the categories that we suggested were that the person identifies as a person with a disability or a disabled person, and we gave lots of explanations of what that could mean. A researcher, and again, some people ticked that they were both a disabled person and a researcher. A consumer of research, so someone who reads research or uses research. A commissioner of research, so far nobody has ticked that box, that they fund research, so that's something we've got to get on. And we gave an other option for people to let us know, provide details of what how they would identify themselves. So the highest number of responses so far has been from the other category, and that has included family members, advocates, civil servants, people who work with and for people with disabilities. And the second highest category has been people with disabilities. So we're fairly pleased with that the response so far. But like I said, the survey is going to remain open for a week after today. So we really do want to hear from as many people as possible And we hope that the results of this work and our conversations today, we will be writing up a report coming out of today that will go to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and help to inform their mandate and how they can progress a human rights and equality research agenda in Ireland, including people with disabilities in that work. So Robbie, I'm just going to hand over to you for any thoughts you might have on what we've been discussing before I open to the floor.
Definitely, thanks. Yeah, there's a couple of things, it is fascinating. There's a couple of things, I think qualitative, for now I completely agree that of course quantitative research is fantastic and obviously much more of it is needed and the funding is needed for that, etc. But just to give examples of where qualitative research is very useful would be, let's say, attendance of a third level institution and where people are taking up and are attending these institutions, what is their quality of life? Can they participate in student life? So is it an enjoyable experience? And that can affect the academic outcome. So a person with a disability may not be able to A, navigate themselves around and may not be assisted in navigating around the campus. They may not be able to find their ways to various groups, you know, the SOCs, the societies. They may not know what's going on. They may not be able to read the information, the notices up to explaining where things are. There's a whole lot of barriers that are there. The qualitative research is far better at finding, and probably combinations of both even, I suppose. Another example would be in the WRC, for instance, with just one, sorry for my anecdote, but there's not enough known one way or the other. It was the WRC, because of the amount of cases that aren't, or that are confidential, or that are struck out or recorded as having been unsuccessful, but then they're settled afterwards as they are taken to the courts. And so there's a quantitative, obviously is lacking there, but in qualitative, for instance, I had a case against Board Gash looking for, I believe that there was no confidentiality to this, so it was touching. Well, I didn't win anyway, but I didn't have time to appeal. But basically I was looking for accessible bills, just email bills, very, very easy. And they offered me braille or phone, that was all, or tape recording. I don't know if tape recorders exist anymore, but that's what they were offering. So they looked as if they were very reasonable. Now what I had was, on one side it was me, then there was the adjudicator here, and then there were 8 assortment of barristers, solicitors, and other people from Board Gash. So if I was the adjudicator, I know which one I would have been safer going with, you know what I mean? So that sort of qualitative research is really important, because like there's no equality of arms there, but that wouldn't show up in any statistics, any quantitative statistics. And also, now, I don't want to seem as if I'm going very hard at quantitative statistics. I love them, I use them. They're very, I am a consumer and everything else of them, you know. But there's internalisation happens, people with disabilities and people without, who are researchers. Internalisation for people with disabilities are, well, I think Nina Simone probably put it better than anybody, and she said it crushes her, the amount of energy that she has to expend on trying to be what others perceive as normal. And that's why she went all the way to Liberia back in 1974 to live there, because she felt she could be normal. She didn't have to live up to be what somebody thought was normal, either normal in a white sense of the word or normal in a black sense of the word. She could be herself. And so people with disabilities are just as prone to internalising a whole lot of inequalities and discriminations and accepting them because that's all they've ever known. So they're not necessarily the font of all wisdom, and that's why it can be useful to have other voices coming in and actually saying, actually, well, we wouldn't put up with that, or I wouldn't, you know. So a balance has to be struck there. On the other side, if you have an quantitative research, and the title of the research is called Making Work Pay, there's a certain internalisation going into economic norms there. I'll go back to Nina Simone's comment, trying to put ableist or able-bodied norms on people with disabilities, who, like, you can look all over the world. The unemployment rates are phenomenally high, and nobody has cracked it. you know. And so the idea of holding out this hope and saying that, you know, either it's around the corner now, obviously, people who want to engage in employment should have the right to be able to do so on an equal level. But where that is not happening, alternatives need to be investigated, and making work pay is only one side of it. For instance, there's the argument we have now of universal basic income, but that's so probably close to the bone that you're not going to see it in much research, you know, because people have excluded that from their internal thought processes themselves. So, and again, I'm just bringing that to Norway, it does work, you know, and it is an idea, and because we're talking about equality of, about people, the whole idea of employment is that people can live meaningful lives. So, again, that could be hidden by quantitative research because they're in a job. But imagine if you're stuck around the side of a, and you're just there as a token civil servant, and you're just there, as I know some people are, and just in a room all day doing nothing from one moment to the next. And it's soul destroying. You know, so I think it's about having a standard of living, or having a quality of life, something that gives you a reason every time you get up in the morning, every day you get up in the morning, a reason to have you enjoying life, and that obviously people feel the world is a better place with you being in it. I think that's what everybody wants. People with disabilities are no different, except employment isn't necessarily the way that they're going to achieve that. And it could be in terms like, just going back to the whole employment, oh, by the way, that making work pay, the medical card thing wasn't extended to the blind pension, it's only disability allowance. So again, it's the whole, people presume disability as being one thing, and things get overlooked in implementation of policy. And the nitty gritty, again, it's qualitative research, could possibly, blind pension, you can only get 20,000 in assets, but disability allowance 50,000. You don't get VRT exemptions if you're blind, but you do if you've got a physical disability. There's a whole load of discriminations within disability. And with nothing, these are obvious, people know about these. They don't need research to know that these happen, but still nothing gets done. And I think, but going back to it, internalisation is something that we all have to look at, and that what we see as norms and appropriate to the way society works may not necessarily be the ways forward, and I think research has to be open to such possibilities, such as universal basic income. I'm not saying it's good, bad or the other, but the openness should be there to accept that there are different paradigms that may be much more relevant to people with disabilities. And yeah, thanks.
So now we'll open it up to the floor for any questions that you might have about what we've just been discussing, or any ideas or contributions you might want to make to this topic of what the future of disability research in Ireland is. So if you just put up your hand. Okay, so Damon, I think Colin's coming to you with the mic. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, it's David Matthew-Wise, Youth Complex. I'm the National Secretary and CEO, unpaid voluntary of the National Council for Disabilities, which is a national group of former networks and groups of all disabilities, coordinated by people with the autistic spectrum, because we have characteristics in every disability grouping. One thing I noticed is you talking about collecting reports and sharing information. If you make sure that you give me a Facebook profile, I can add you into our pages so you can share information to people with disabilities and autism and other disability groups all over the country. We've got a large network of facilities, and Facebook is for lots of people the only way they have access to information, because they're completely isolated and not had any access to anything since government unfunded our predecessor PWDI in 2011. So Facebook is, for many, the communication resource. Also, I can copy any report or information on rights to the UN Committee in Geneva, which I have represented Ireland to as representative of people with disabilities in Ireland.
Thanks, that's a really useful suggestion for how we can share more information about research. I saw another hand up, I think, somewhere at the front. Yeah, Jonathan.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Angus from Fiona Productions. Thank you very much for having this day bring us together, and specifically for this question, looking at the future of disability research. And I'm wondering whose agenda is served by having the idea of disability research. And I'm thinking that the feminist movement was brought to a different level when universities started referring to gender studies, right? Because it was no longer about half of society, and it was no longer really about making a separation. Also, you might say mental health was a great improvement over mental illness, because again, it includes all of us. And I'm wondering if any of you feel that it's an important shift that we need to work toward, to find the language that's referring to what happens to people when they're marginalized as a result of having unusual challenges or impairments or whatever it is, but also embracing all of society and recognizing that there's not a person in this room or in this city whose life isn't directly personally impacted in some way by this issue. Isn't that the only way to really get us all to buy in, is to stop talking about a binary human experience when we know that it's actually something that we made up, that we all live life with challenges and we all have abilities as well.
Thanks. Robbie, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks. I hope you don't get tired of my voice. Sorry, I'm back again. I think it is pretty interesting, but there's a couple of things. There's a certain relativism. I hear, sure, we all have challenges, and it shows that sort of phrasing could be in danger of minimising or showing, allowing the continued existence of misunderstandings of, the whole thing with, one of the major things with people with disability is that people with the least abilities have the least voice. And it's not comparable to identity issues, and it's not comparable to our nationality or ethnicity or other things. It's far more fundamental. And I think, obviously, also in terms of language, recently, some meeting or other last year actually, somebody objected to the use of, I'm preparing a document on manual for pedestrians in planning. And somebody objected to the use of the word vulnerable pedestrians to apply to people over 75, children and people with disabilities, on the grounds that people with disabilities aren't vulnerable. It's just societies that make them vulnerable, not people with disabilities. Now, there might be certain philosophical, you go down that road and all the rest of it, but ultimately, you use shorthand and it's useful. We could have called ourselves the blind, the visually impaired alliance, but blind is people who wouldn't get so head up. People generally know what it means. Let's explain it to, And so be worried about the political correctness side of things. But at the same time, I think it is positive to use the word accessibility studies instead of disability studies. And I do see that definitely where things can be made positive, if they don't compromise the meaning, I think that is, in fact, that enhances the meaning when you say accessibility studies, because it's accessible to all, and there's a certain equality there, so I certainly get that, but generally speaking, I'd be wary about getting too hung up on terminology, and I think that also feminism, was a few divides within the various waves, and language was part of the problem there.
Do you want to comment on that?
Well, on the positive side, I think the whole notion of universal design, for example, of designing environments and whether they be physical environments or products or services or how people interact with each other in a way that works for anybody, regardless of age, size, ability or disability, which is the definition in the Disability Act. I think that kind of all-encompassing approach is really valuable, because certainly when you're dealing with the business world, that if they think we're only dealing with, 0.05% of people, with a particular degree of impairment. And you're saying, well, actually, no, we're dealing with people who, all sorts of people have challenges, and, that a thin person can go through a door that's designed for a fat person, so that if you build it wide enough, then everybody can use it. So I think that universality thing can be very valuable in those kind of contexts. But in a research context, I would be a bit like Robbie. I'd be a bit wary that if you talk about, social research and we're all in it together and everybody who's facing challenges, that actually the specific issues and the specific challenges for people with disabilities could get lost. So I think there is a real value in doing that. And I also think there are some technical issues around certain kinds of disability research, not all forms of disability research, but for example, if you want to research the lives and the opinions and the lived experience of people with profound communication disabilities or profound intellectual disabilities, you're going to need particular ways of doing that, and that if somebody who's doing just ordinary interviewing anybody mightn't have that skill in augmented communication to be able to do that, so that that I think it is a legitimate field in itself, embedded in a wider field. I also think it's really valuable to, we talked earlier about transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches. I'm originally an economist by training, and I suppose the old Marxist in me would say, follow the money trail and, look at the economic roots of issues as well. And having that perspective around, what would it cost to fix it and what would it take to fix it, and the practicalities comes from my discipline. And other people are coming from other disciplines. And I think it's that sharing of insights and sharing of techniques is really important. And finally, I just want to pick up on something that Eleanor said, which is about how do we find the people to do our research with, people with disabilities. And I think there's huge value in the random sampling. Now, sometimes with people with disabilities in a very big society, it's very hard because you're talking about a relatively small number of people finding enough to be statistically valid. And that's where I think something like the National Disability Survey, which had 14,000 people with disabilities, who were followed up from people who had declared a disability in the census. So they were actually a random sample. And I remember before the National Disability Survey was undertaken, and a couple of people in a couple of disability organisations saying, sure, we know it all already, and we've told you, and this is a waste of time. And actually when the researchers went out and they started talking to people with disabilities who were just selected at random, they weren't activists, they were just anybody and everybody who just said they had a disability in the census. That people said nobody'd ever come and ask them about the challenges and barriers that they faced, and the issues around technology and the attitudes of their neighbours and their friends, and where they got support from and what was difficult for them in all sorts of domains of life, because it covered housing and transport and education and training and work and income and health and all sorts of things. So that actually representative portrait of people is really, really valuable. And if something is selected randomly from the population, then you can generalise. Where if it's a selected sample of a convenient sample of people through a gatekeeper organisation, you mayn't actually be able to generalise from that. And often the number of people you get to talk to in that way is very small, and again the sample size is too small to generalise up. So that while you are giving something that is rich and descriptive, and certainly I agree with Robbie that we need to always complement our quantitative and our qualitative research there. They're not inseparable. But that you actually need something where you're able to say, well, these conclusions stand up because we've drawn a random sample, because we've been able to validly say, statistically this is the margin of error around this. And so I think the use of random sampling is really, really important.
Thank you. Just to add, I kind of agree with much of what's been said. I think we can get too hung up on language, but I also think it's sometimes useful to think about things differently. And I was struck by, John O'Brien's centre is called the Centre on Human Policy. I knew it was human something, I had to quickly check what it was. Human policy. And his work is obviously a lot about people with disabilities experiences. So I think sometimes and things like universal design or accessibility are also good umbrella terms that are more inclusive and people can feel more part of, and it applies to people who, not just those who might identify or disclose that they have a disability, which is very useful. But I think I agree too that there are times when we need to talk specifically about disability, about the kinds of exclusion that this particular group in society experience. I think that's no different than any other marginalised group. Sometimes it is important to talk about the experiences of that group. But I think what's essential is that we frame it in human rights and equality language. So that's where I would see connecting and making solidarity and connections with other groups who've experienced similar things. Just from my own research experience, something I found very valuable has been to always try to make things as cross-disability as possible, because even though people might have very different experiences, sometimes the experience of the marginalisation and the oppression is so similar that people would never have expected. So in Voices, for example, we had people from 11 countries with all different kinds of labels of disability who nonetheless were able to identify with each other's stories and find able to support each other and talk about that happened to me too, and that's not okay that happened to you. And to hear that from somebody with a similar experience, I think would be really valuable, really meaningful. So let's see if there are any other questions from the audience. Yeah, Peter.
Just to say, I suppose, when we're talking about research, even though we're talking about emancipatory research, accepted research, or the methods of research, at some point there has to communicate a policy. And at that point there needs to be clarifications of terminology and words. So even today, the word disability is used in very different ways. You can tell people with disabilities or disabled people. So even today, it's very unclear what the word disability actually means. Now, we are in an academic setting. I'm an academic myself with St. Andrew's College. And it was students gave me an essay where they clarified the word disability. It was somewhere back. So I attended a conference like today, and I have both in the Republic, just has been on for 20 years or more. There's never been a clear understanding or shared understanding of the word disability. And that needs to happen, because it does happen in other places. Other academic conferences in Europe, it isn't clear what we mean by disability. So I think, I'm not going to explain it today, but I'll explain it in the afternoon. But I think around the issue of disability, we have to clear it. And take my own experience, go grew up a personal job. I became disabled when the special bus turned up to make this special school. Before that, I didn't become disabled. So even though I had cerebral palsy, my disability was a special bus turned up. So these are one of the things that are called conferences, not just this conference, but a lot of conferences in the Republic. I've never really clarified the word disability and its use. So, thanks very much.
Robbie, do you want to?
I do, yeah.
Yeah.
I can see where the self-identification or the identification of society, and that there are sort of ethnographic probably research that could go into that. But I think in terms of the practical day-to-day issues, for instance, if I can't get a material in an accessible format, that's not an abstract. That is just a very real practical problem. And the best way I can frame that is using human rights approach, human rights language, human rights legislation, whether that's the Equal Status Act, Disability Act, I don't care what it's called, but that's just, people use that for shorthand. And I'm willing to engage with the thing as it's there, even though I'm not all that happy with it. I could say with the system that's there, for instance, and research needs to be done into this, there's the public sector duty under the Human Rights and Equality Act 2014. How many, there are 600 quangos in the state, let's say, including the departments and all the rest. How many of them have actually done anything about that? So so I know you see, we can get into the ethnographic, but there's such basic problems that are not being addressed. And another one would be Workplace Relations Commission. I mean, for instance, the Workplace Relations Commission website is currently inaccessible to people with a visual impairment. So that means that 55,000 people, they're excluded from taking equal status cases at the moment. And the WRC doesn't even have an access officer. How many quangos have an access officer under the Disability Act? That's a very easy piece of research to do. So it's not just looking at research from the bottom up, but it's also, you could look at research from, is the government or is the state, is official, where regardless of what language is being used, is it living up to its own commitments to that language, using that language? And I'd say it's easy enough to have research to show that they clearly are not. And you can do all the research you like among the smaller groups or among the bottom-up research from DPOs, etc. But once that final disjunct is continuing to happen, once such prejudices and neglect continue to happen, I'm not saying it's a waste of time, but I think there's a lot needs to be done on that other element as well. I know I deviated a little bit from the point of the definitions, but I think that there are more solid. We have to deal with what's solid and what's in front of us, But I do completely respect what you're saying, and I think it is very interesting, Peter. Thanks.
From a research point of view, there's definitely different definitions of disability in all sorts of data and all sorts of studies, and sometimes that makes it hard to kind of add up the data from 2 or 3 small studies to make one big study. And there's been a lot of work done internationally by a group called the Washington City Group under the World Health Organization on defining disability in particular ways, so that you can pick a definition that suits your purpose, but that actually, from a research point of view, you can know what like is through it's called the ICF, the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health. But basically, it's based on a biopsychosocial model that looks at the interaction between a person's impairment and their environment, which is in a broad sense not just the physical environment but also the attitudes that they get, the barriers and supports in terms of people's attitudes and in terms of supports or assistive technology and so on, and then looking at functional difficulties that people may have. One of the areas I think that has been quite negative in Ireland has been where we have taken diagnosis as a basis for disability. Now I wear glasses and I've worn them since I was 4, but I would never regard myself as disabled by my vision impairment, but because by having the right glasses I can live an absolutely normal life, except maybe fly a plane or be a ballet dancer. But I'm clumsy anyway, so I'll never be a ballet dancer. But that if you just take vision impairment, that's a whole spectrum from people, with very mild correction of their glasses to me with more significant correction of my glasses to somebody who cannot see. And the issues in terms of barriers on participation are different. So if you move away from what is the medical origin to what are the difficulties and the challenges that people face as a way of defining disability, that's, I think, much more useful. And there's very interesting research done by Brenda Gannon and Brian Nolan in the SRI, where they looked at all sorts of social exclusion, poverty, employment, different dimensions of issues for people with disabilities. And they found that people who had an impairment but were not hampered in everyday life, that yes, they had a different life experience from others, but that tended to be because they were drawn from an older population. As Robbie has said, most of us acquire disabilities as we get older, and so that it was the fact that they were older, and many of them came from the age before free second level education. So that explained, if you like, their disadvantages in society, where if you were more significantly challenged in everyday stuff, then you were much more likely to be socially excluded, and the degree of difficulty you found led to greater degrees of social exclusion. So I think, getting the right language to define disability from a research point of view gives you really, is very, very important, very valuable, and to be able to kind of aggregate research studies in that way.
Just to add to that I think in my own work what I find most helpful is to use the CRPD's conceptualisation of disability, which I would say is not a definition because it is open-ended. It says persons with disabilities include, and then it gives a tentative list. And I think that was a really helpful way for people who wouldn't previously have identified as disabled to feel that there was something important in the convention in terms of their human rights. So particularly, as we know with the negotiations, people with psychosocial disability, so people with that mental health lived experience, who would not have been comfortable otherwise identifying as persons with disabilities, found that this was a moment in which they could secure rights that they really needed and wanted. And it was the same with the deaf community, who would also talk about particularly the sign language user community not being part of the disability community, but the deaf community being a minority language, and a sign language being a minority language, and a cultural community. So I think we can get too hung up on definitions, especially in academia, and sometimes we get so hung up on them that we ignore some of the real life barriers and experiences that are happening to whatever group that we are struggling to define. So in the work that we do here, I would always say, we consider persons with disabilities to include all of these things, and even people who would not identify as having a disability but feel that they have been discriminated against by others who think they do have a disability. That's enough for me to consider that you fall within this category if you've experienced disability-based discrimination, no matter how you identify. So that's how I try to square that circle. So at this point, I think we're going to break for coffee, and we'll be back here at 11:30 for our first round of paper sessions. So I just want to thank Robbie and Etna for their contributions this morning. I hope you all found them as interesting as I did, and we'll see you back here at 11:30. That worked out very nicely. It's almost like we planned it. Exactly. We can relax now for the rest of it.
And actually, I left some headphones, I think, up by the...
Oh, did you?
By the workers or whatever. I'm just checking. Actually, I might have them here. Actually, no, I haven't.
Do you have them?
Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. This is your program.
Oh, yeah, excellent.
Yeah, no problem.
That's fine. I'll keep that.
Oh, yeah, that's yours. That was great, Robbie. I haven't met you before. My name is Jenny. I work with Eleanor as well, the CPD, yeah, on the Reproductive Justice Project. So I
don't often have an opportunity to explore
what we're doing.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
I know, and I just have like
to take you out of your comfort zone as well. And how are you doing a PhD in Irish? Is that what you were saying? Oh my God. Amazing.
Shaped.
How far into it are you?
If they accept another year off the books, you can expect I'll just be here 6 years. That'll finish it. I have to finish my certificate.
Okay, so that's another reason, another deadline to hit it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
No, I'm
great.
writing it up yet.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, once the writing process starts, you just get stuck into it.
Yeah,
so.
it's not written about 25% of it.
Oh, great. That's a good start.
I've got 400,000 words in PowerPoint.
Okay, I don't think I had many words, to start off with in my writing process. I started from zero.
The corporation is the overall principle. It's not like you can, the analysis of 100,000 appendices and the text.
Okay.
We're not including footnotes, so we haven't to shift the whole of the appendices into the footnotes.
Okay, exactly.
So no, it's not the clockwork.
Yeah, you get there. It's the discipline even of writing.
Okay, Karen, can you hear me now?
Hi, Cormac.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Can you hear me, Cormac?
I can hear you. Where are we gone now? I can hear you.
Okay, I can't hear you though.
You can't hear me at all.
So,
Okay. Let's see. 1, 2, 1, 2. That should
does
be
it help if I put on the webcam? No.